Joyce, this is a dictation of the draft of Dalgleish Finding the Body. Double spacing as usual, please.
What's it? Oh, that's mine.
There's icemist volcanoes.
The Vietnamese communists here.
The 70s and 80s were a time of profound and often dislocating change.
I do think fiction ought to be asking the great, unanswerable, adolescent questions. Why are we set upon this planet? For what purpose?
Reagan's years are beginning to show.
Holding a mirror up to these convulsions was a new wave of writers.
If I spend a day writing something violent or something terrible, at the end of that day, what I will feel, if I think I've achieved what I've set out to achieve, will be elation and pleasure.
You're all dressed up looking lovely.
The novels were a celebration and a condemnation of a world in flux.
Let's try it out.
You write out of a society, and the society changes. And if you read newspapers or look at the television, things are bound to come in to you from that society.
Their fiction was as diverse and unsettling as the society it reflected.
Things perhaps are in flux and change at the moment, but we're not quite clear what's happening.
Some of the biggest one-day falls.
West Wales are now underwater.
They were irreverent, fanciful, and provocative.
The important thing about writing is that it's not true.
The Evening Standard comes up with, guess what? Skipper Ted full ahead.
Go out and fight for a better Britain. Fight like you have never fought before.
Right from the start of the decade, political unrest typified the 70s. Long-held assumptions about society were being called into question. Nothing sacred was Angela Carter's motto.
Women must decide their fate.
One of the most vocal groups was the women's movement.
Why are you dressed like this?
This is International Women's Day today, and you sent a male to interview me and a male cameraman. Where are the all women cameramen at the BBC?
Feminism's spreading influence soon came to be reflected in the novels of the 70s. Faye Weldon worked in the advertising industry before becoming a full-time writer. In her novels, she often portrays women whose lives are constrained by biology and domesticity. It was a protest against Miss World that opened her eyes to the politics of feminism.
Women had been protesting outside the Albert Hall about Miss World. I think they'd actually thrown a smoke bomb, and this was seen as the most extraordinary piece of madness. Nobody could understand what on earth they were going on about, really. And they were presented as being neurotic, jealous, ugly, probably lesbian women who had failed to get a man, and that was why they were angry and trying to upset their pretty sisters. I realised that it was quite sudden, really, like a sort of penny dropping, that the protesters were right and that you could look at the world differently. You could see that it was not inevitable and natural that women should want to be pretty or beautiful, and that the women who were protesting were perfectly reasonable, and that, what's more, it was the beginning of something that you could see would almost change the world, that everything could be looked at differently once you started looking at the relationship between men and women differently and didn't just believe that it was as it was and could never be changed. It is nature, they say, that makes us get married. Nature, they say, that makes us crave to have babies. You must breastfeed, they say. It's natural, best for baby. Eat raw carrots, yeast tablets, sea salt, honey, and so on, natural. Eschew white sugar, chemical salt, artificial sweeteners, preservatives. Unnatural. It's nature that makes us love our children, clean our houses, gives us a thrill of pleasure when we please the homecoming male. Who is this nature?
Angela Carter's feminism took a different tack. She drew out the sexuality latent in traditional folk tales to create stories that subverted the dominant male view of sex and power. In her reading from The Bloody Chamber, the language is provocatively direct.
The Count got off his horse, unfastened his breeches, and thrust his virile member into the dead girl. The Countess reined in her stamping mare and watched him narrowly. He was soon finished. Then the girl began to melt. Soon there was nothing left of her but a feather a bird might have dropped, a blood stain, like the trace of a fox's kill on the snow, and the rose she had pulled off the bush.
Arthur Marshall, we're listening to Angela Carter read her story. Did you manage to get to grips with that?
Yes, I've read the whole book. I thought her stories are beautifully written, but on the whole, I don't really like stories of fantasy. I like to know where I am. I like stories that begin, Mrs. Henderson walked slowly into Sainsbury's and purchased a pound of cod. Then you know exactly where you are.
Just to say, I'd like to know the Sainsbury's where you can buy cod.
The Exeter one.
You fantasist.
Angela Carter's fiction is distinctly undomestic. In novels like The Passion of New Eve and Nights at the Circus, an awareness of the power relations between the sexes goes with a taste for the fabulous and fantastical.
The questions that I ask myself, I think they're very much to do with reality. I would really like to have had the guts and the energy and so on to be able to write about, people having battles with the DHSS. But I haven't. I've done other things. I mean, I'm an arty person. Okay, I write overblown, purple, self-indulgent prose. So fucking what?
She's the most imaginative of the post-war writers, linguistically and in registers of different moods. You pick up a page of Angela Carter and the flashing of her wit and her intelligence and her imagination just happens in every sentence.
In Wise Children, her interest in gender politics was cloaked in a playful theatricality.
I've been writing a great deal about women who are in, quote, show business, unquote. Nora and Dora in Wise Children are emphatically not actresses, they're hoofers. And they're useful people. Sounds beastly to talk about my characters in this way. They're useful people because, of course, their living, their whole livelihood is based on the public presentation of certain kinds of aspects of sexuality, certain kinds of aspects of femininity, which they're quite conscious about. Being a showgirl is a very simple metaphor simply for being a woman, for being aware of your femininity, being aware of yourself as a woman, and having to use it to negotiate with the world.
It took an age, but we did it. We painted the faces that we always used to have on the faces we have now. From a distance of 30 feet, with the light behind us, we looked at first glance just like the girl who danced with the Prince of Wales when Nightingale sang in Berkeley Square on a foggy day in London town. The deceptions of memory. That girl was smooth as an egg, and the lipstick never ran down little cracks and fissures round her mouth, because in those days there were none. It's every woman's tragedy, said Nora, as we contemplated our painted masterpieces, that after a certain age she looks like a female impersonator. Mind you, we've known some lovely female impersonators in our time.
The characters seem often to be drawn from the world that we recognise, but there's something faintly gothic and grotesque going on.
When you read a page of Angela Carter, it's a tissue of different quotations, allusions and echoes. She's read and she's got an amazing sort of love and festive appetite for the past. So she's got, Keats in there and Shakespeare in there and numerous, Japanese and Indian and God knows what. I mean, it's all part of the music of her language. And And that she wants us to see that.
They'd often pry the children loose from the ground. They wouldn't have to travel far to find little girls, but often they'd have to dig deep to get boys.
She was also, a great weaver of brocade, beautiful linguistic brocade. And she was absolutely irreverent and completely blasphemous. And that, I think, is very much a characteristic of this period, the 70s and the 80s.
Until she came out on the other side of the earth.
Well, a very good evening to you from Stationers' Hall in the City of London, when literature comes face-to-face with stardust. The announcement of the winner of the Booker McConnell Award for Fiction for 1983.
The televising of the Booker Prize, fiction's equivalent of the Oscars, began in the 1970s. The cash prize, awarded to a novel written in English by a writer from the Commonwealth or Ireland, was sponsored by Booker McConnell, an industrial conglomerate. For the first time, literary novelists were thrust into the spotlight.
Does it make you feel a particular sort of author, having written a prize-winning book?
Well, it makes you think that some people must have enjoyed reading it, and that's worth it in itself, I enjoy writing anyway, and I imagine most people do, and that's why so many novels get written. But I am writing one now about the BBC, so we'll just have to see how that turns out.
Well, in the hall is a who's who of publishing.
But television didn't always know its way round the literary world. When Selina Scott tried to get a comment out of a guest, she appeared to have no idea that she was speaking to Angela Carter, one of the judges.
Here. Madam, can I ask you what you think of the choice of the winner?
I was one of the judges. Does that exclude me from this?
I'm sorry about that. What's your name?
Angela Carter.
Hello. Yes, tell me, what do you think?
It's a very powerful and impressive novel.
Was it your choice?
You shouldn't ask a question like that.
Why not?
Ask Clay, because we have a consensus.
I see. All right, Angela, thank you.
Without doubt, the televising of the Booker helped popularise novels which might otherwise have struggled to reach an audience. But the prize was nearly derailed by the 1972 winner, the radical art critic and novelist John Berger.
John Berger, this evening you will be handed £5,000 as a prize for this book. What are you going to do with the money?
The prize is given by Bookers, Booker McKennell, who are a firm who have extensive trading interests in the Caribbean for 130 years. The extreme poverty is the direct consequence of the exploitation of companies like Booker's and others. And so I intend, as a revolutionary writer, to share this prize with people in and from the Caribbean, people who are involved in a struggle to resist such exploitation and eventually to expropriate companies like Booker's. I'm actually going to give half the prize to the London-based Black Panther movement.
Free Bobby Seale! Free Bobby Seale! Free Bobby Seale! Free Bobby Seale! Free Bobby Seale!
Radical public activism was nowhere to be found in the work of two rising stars of the time, Ian McEwan and Martin Amis. Their theme was the thrills and spills of adolescence. In Amis's first novel, The Rachel Papers, he captured the self-absorption of youth with a fastidious attention to language and a filthy sense of humour.
The Rachel Papers, by Martin Amis, is about a young man in London cramming hard to get into Oxford to read English literature and learning fast about life in the metropolis. Sex and scholarship seem to be the two drives in this book. But what did you find were the dangers of writing about adolescence?
Well, the first one perhaps was just the same as any first novelist feels. The fear of being no good, having any talent, can't make it come alive. The second one, intensified by that, perhaps, was the danger of making it boring in the way adolescence is boring. Hysterical, winsome, grotesque, a sort of pimply rant. So I found I had to detach myself. Although I was very near to adolescence, I wrote the book when I was 22. I had to get some sort of perspective on it to make it interesting to non-adolescents.
Another almost a convention of novels about adolescence is that they should have a go at what you call the oldsters at some stage or other about something or other. What particularly do you think you were having a go at?
Well, the narrator is physically very self-conscious and actually treats his body as someone of 60 might worry about their bodies. So naturally, the world of the oldsters is sort of grand guignol, decay and horror, and that's just to indulge the adolescent disgust that is apparently very prevalent at the moment.
What depressed me in a way, and what I wanted to ask you was, why the hostility towards women in it? It really made me feel a bit creepy sometimes.
Well, it was about a special sort of adolescence, at the point where sex has become fundamentally unmysterious. I tried to exaggerate this. I mean, I wouldn't like you to think I felt that way about women.
That's really what I wanted to know.
No, not at all. No, I'm much more gallantry than my hero. But he, as Melvin said, it's about sex and scholarship in a jokey way. And he's scholarly about sex and sexual about scholarship. He's read up on sex. I thought this was just the only way to make it funny, to make actually carnal rather than erotic sex funny, rather than boring or disgusting or whatever.
With the Rage Papers, what you get, I mean, the first line, you get the big-cocked, well-travelled Charles Highway. You get a sense of humour and chutzpah that is utterly unique, that is entirely full of a kind of cruelty, a cruel sense of humour that I think is wonderful. And you get a cruelty towards all forms of cliché, basically. So you get sentence after sentence that is being more watched over, more policed than I think, certainly, I'd ever really seen in contemporary English fiction.
Nice and sleazy does it.
It's a measure of the excitement generated by young writers that when the book programme in 1979 first featured Ian McEwan, it was prepared to travel to his flat in South London rather than requesting him to slog out to Television Centre. After 2 collections of short stories, McEwan had just published his first novel, The Cement Garden, in which 4 children play bizarre Freudian games after the death of their parents.
A lot of people have thought that the world of your stories is a very nasty world. I mean, horrible things are being imagined and some pretty horrible things are being done. What do you think about the complaint that that's just voguish nastiness?
I suppose we should just talk about it in the simplest way possible, and that is, if I'm sitting down facing an empty sheet of paper, what is going to compel me into writing fiction is not what is nice and easy and pleasant and somehow affirming, but somehow what is bad, difficult and unsettling. That's the kind of tension I need to start me writing. Beyond that, I suppose I've always been trying to assert some kind of slender optimism in my story. And I don't think I can really do that unless I can do it in a world that seems to me fundamentally threatening. So what I really worry about is gratuitous optimism, not gratuitous violence.
I know you wouldn't want to be typed as the adolescence man, but you write a lot about that particular hallucinatory clarity of one's physical self and about masturbation and so on.
Adolescents are a sort of extraordinary special case of people. I mean, they are close both to childhood and yet they are constantly baffled and irritated by the initiations into what's on the other side, the shadow line, as it were. They are perfect outsiders, in a sense.
It got off on getting the reader sort of, sucking your teeth at the, what you were reading, because it was so, the edge of it was so sharp that you sort of couldn't take it. And but he made you take it. This was sort of like sadistic writing. I mean, not just representing sadistic acts, but also acting sadistically a little bit on the reader.
When I'm working, when I'm writing, I do feel extraordinarily free. Even when I'm trying to put together the most unfree situations, I do feel colossal freedom myself. There's nothing more exhilarating than to be writing again. Your food tastes better, your step has more spring, there's, the air that fills your lungs seems that much cleaner.
28, take 2 and board.
McEwan made no explicit connection between the social breakdown in the cement garden and events in 70s Britain. But the country had experienced its fair share of chaos. There was a further wave of strikes towards the end of the decade that became known as the Winter of Discontent. It gave the Tories the break they were looking for. In May 1979, Mrs. Thatcher ousted the beleaguered Labour government.
I'm just aware of the very great responsibility. Very great responsibility. But it's very exciting. And somehow one is very calm about it.
She promised change, but the full extent of what she had in mind wasn't yet apparent. Fiction wasn't immediately interested in Mrs. Thatcher. That would come later. It was changes in the literary landscape that preoccupied critics. In the 70s and 80s, Malcolm Bradbury, a novelist and professor of English at the University of East Anglia, regularly appeared on television as literature's weatherman, pointing out the warm fronts sweeping in from the feminist movement or the fresh southerlies blowing up from the post-colonial world.
I think there are two great experimental forces at the moment. One is the new language that's coming through from women's fiction, because it's not just the presentation of characters. It's like this is happening in language itself. The impact is on language itself. The other big impact is actually the kind of new voicing that's coming from third world writers, from writers in other countries, male or female, who are actually disputing our possession of the English language.
In 1981, a hugely ambitious novel stole the crown from English. Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children.
The winner of this year's Booker Prize is Salman Rushdie.
Salman Rushdie had been born in Mumbai into a middle-class Muslim family, but was sent to school in England. Midnight's Children is the fictional autobiography of Salim Sinai, born at the moment of India's independence in 1947. In this reading, he's played by Ben Kingsley.
I was born in Dr. Nalika's nursing home on August the 15th, 1947. And the time matters too. Well, then at night. No, it's important to be more. On the stroke of midnight, as a matter of fact. Clock hands joined palms in respectful greeting as I came. Oh, spell it out, spell it out. At the precise instant of India's arrival at independence, I tumbled forth into the world.
I was born 2.5 months before the British left, and there was this family joke that there was some relationship between the two events. And when I sat down to compose the book, I just thought it would be funnier to make it exact. And so the book really does arise out of that insane coincidence, and then suggests that there's something magical in that, and that the child and the country become twins. And it was really a device for discussing the relationship between private lives and public lives, and public affairs. And Salim believes comically that history is his fault, and sets out over the course of 250,000 words to prove it. People of my parents' generation all say that independence represented a time of hope. And the argument of the book is that during the course of the next 30 years, that hope, that optimism was betrayed. This is why optimism occurs in the book as a disease. I mean, people catch it like an infection, and they keep getting cured of it in various ways, but it keeps recurring. And the children of midnight themselves are basically, I think, a metaphor of hope. And when they get destroyed, that to me was a symbol of the destruction of the good things about independence.
The real achievement of Midnight's Children is the setting, because there are so many competing perspectives, so many competing tribal interests, so many competing political factions, that India is almost a reflection of the speaker. And it's a perfect match. It might sound, a simple formula, but no one had tried this before. And to use the formula, if you like, of magic realism and place it in India, it's a beautiful marriage.
The novel is not an indigenous form in India. I mean, there's not really a long history of prose fiction. It more or less arrived with the British. And now there are English language and Hindi and other languages novels in India, but it's not really, it's a grafted form rather than one that grew there. The form that is indigenous is tale-telling, storytelling, fables, and that's been there forever. Because I think, you see, that realism in the novel, even in England, is relatively recent, and realism in storytelling in India never existed. There was a sort of belief that stories should clearly be lies, and they should clearly be untrue, they should be wonderful tales, and that they didn't have to conform to the descriptions of the literal world.
Rushdie's love of rich visual imagery owes a lot to another vigorous tradition of Indian storytelling, the Bollywood movie.
So it's easy, actually, in a way, to laugh about these films because they're relatively melodramatic and corny. But the thing that's important about them is they try and be sort of compendiums of human experience. They have to have something of everything. So they have funny uncles and villains and fight sequences and romance. In a way, because I grew up with these films around me, I've tried to do a sort of literary version of that, really, in the book, and also try and bring some all-human life in.
The book is basically a tragedy, but it's a tragedy written like a comedy. The book ends badly, or sadly, anyway, and it's a kind of elegy for childhood.
Well, I was just bowled over because I read it in the manuscript. Rushdie was a neighbour of mine at the time, and it's almost impossible to remember, but he was unsuccessful. and he asked me, rather, sort of ruefully, if I would read his latest effort. And I remember my heart sank. It was really long. And but I thought, I must help this poor, struggling writer. But I read it, and I remember the atmosphere in the book was so vivid and so exuberant and colourful and alive, and this book just bowled me away. I couldn't wait to read some more of it. And I said, this is stunning. You've done a stunning thing. And then I had about a week when I was the person who had helped him, and after that I was forgotten.
Competition for the 1981 Booker was fierce. Rushdie had been up against D.M. Thomas's White Hotel, but in the end, the prize went to Midnight's Children.
We feel it's a very notable winner, a brilliant book.
Malcolm Bradbury was chair of the judges. But behind the scenes, it had been a different story.
Malcolm actually argued for the White Hotel, and he also, I remember, argued that he should have a casting vote so that he could, as it were, double his vote at the last moment, whereby it would come up for the White Hotel. And we all said, no, you can't do that. So Midnight Children won. And Malcolm then spent the rest of his life saying, I was the person who gave Midnight Children the Booker Prize.
Salman Rushdie has a phrase from an essay, The Empire Writes Back. And that kind of sums up a certain kind of touché quality of this writing. It was, the British went to India, colonised the place, gave India railways and a bureaucracy and English. And India started to own English. And now English is being spoken back to the mother country.
It's almost, chicken or turkey lib at night tonight, because almost everything has a chicken or a turkey in it. I'm at the moment not talking about chickens or turkeys.
The promotion of Midnight's Children was helped along by Rushdie himself, who turned out to be a dab hand at off-the-cuff speaking.
Has it been a jolly and exciting and hectic year for you?
It has been very pleasant. I must say that I'm extremely relieved it's all going to happen to somebody else in a few minutes.
Why?
Well, I think there's only, one can only be Miss World for so long.
There are benefits to being Miss World, however. Peripheral there may be. You were invited, I gather, to Downing Street immediately after the last year's...
Well, that was probably the juiciest thing that happened. I had a very strange phone call from a very posh female voice, which revealed itself to be speaking from the office of the Prime Minister, and said that this was at the beginning of the Festival of India when Mrs. Gandhi was coming over. and said that Mrs. Thatcher was having a lunch at Downing Street in honour of Mrs. Gandhi and wished that me to come. And I thought it was a hoax. And I said, "Is this a hoax?" The voice got very cross. It's a perfectly genuine invitation. And so I said that it just seemed very peculiar that of all people they should ask to a lunch in Mrs. Gandhi's honour somebody who'd just written a book that was extremely rude about it. And the voice at the other end of the phone displayed symptoms of terminal panic. and said, "Oh, gosh." She said, "Oh, well, you see, it was the Foreign Office that recommended you." And you think they'd have read your book, wouldn't you?
Though Rushdie had made London his home, Midnight's Children is essentially a love letter to the India of his childhood. A younger writer, Hanif Qureshi, created characters who are largely indifferent to their Pakistani legacy. They're usually London-born, like Qureshi himself, who wrote plays first, then films such as My Beautiful Laundrette, before turning to fiction with The Buddha of Suburbia.
Hanif Qureshi was a suburban London boy, mixed marriage, a British guy. He was a London lad. He wasn't a new immigrant with plastic shoes and a cardboard suitcase kind of turning up fresh off the boat. He was a geezer. He was a punk. He was interested in being part of this metropolitan life. But there he was a Pakistani guy also. And he started writing about that, and The Buddha of Suburbia, with all this comic absurdity of that position, was in many ways the first sort of expression of that.
The front door opened. Helen's dad stood there. He was a big man with a black beard and thick arms. I imagined that he had hairy shoulders and, worst of all, a hairy back like Peter Sellers and Sean Connery. I kept a list of actors with hairy backs which I constantly updated. And then I went whites. But obviously, not white enough. Because hairy back let go of the dog he was holding. A great King Dane. And it padded towards me, its mouth hanging open like a cave.
He allowed himself to do with people who shared his background the sort of things that it would have been politically incorrect for a white English writer to have done. Great. It works very well.
In my own life, people used to throw that book at me about once a week and say, "Hey, Harry, have you read this book?" And I'd be like, "Yeah." But it was, it was an important book because it was a book that so many of us recognised. We understood ourselves from that. But for years, Hanif had to stand around and drinking warm white wine at parties, talking to earnest people with wooden earrings about multiculturalism.
Well, it's liberals really who get all tangled up in all of that because liberals want to see black or Asian people as a homogenous group, often as the beneficiaries of their attention and worthy goodness. But as far as I'm concerned, all my characters are equal in my eyes. I mean, if you're writing about an Asian businessman, he may or may not be corrupt. If he's corrupt, then he's corrupt because he's Asian. It doesn't mean that you can draw a line around him and say, you can't satirize him. I don't understand that line at all, and it's never been anything that's interested me, though in the 70s there was much talk about how do we represent women, how do we represent the working class, how do we represent black or Asian people, should we do it this way, that way or the other? Well, if you try to write according to those rules, you'd be so inhibited you'd never be able to write anything. You just have to write as you feel and hope that some sort of humanity in the end emerges.
That there was such a thing as a literary establishment, and that it spoke with an English accent, and that London was its headquarters, and that the Booker Prize dinner was its tribal gathering, angered many Scottish writers in the 80s.
Are you a Glasgow writer or a Scottish writer, or is there a difference?
Was Dickens a London writer or an English writer? That question, sir, was unworthy of you.
The old industrial heartlands of Scotland had been hit hard by the restructuring of the British economy in the early years of the 80s. Heavy industries slid into terminal decline and unemployment rocketed. James Kelman, a writer from Glasgow, gave Scotland's working class a literary voice in stories and novels like The Bus Conductor Hines. He spoke about identity and language on The Late Show.
If you're a writer from the working class, say, or if you're black, if you're from the Afro-Caribbean community, if you're Irish, from Yorkshire, if you want to actually write about your own culture from within your own experience, you've got to find a way of getting rid of the values that say your culture is rubbish, right? And that means like working your way through language. You know, if you write in English normally, you can't help but take on the values of the English upper classes, because that's what language is. That's language as it gets enforced in the education system. No one from my culture is allowed to have an inner life at all. There is no being within our existence. We're the behaviourist cutouts.
James Cameron was choosing to write about those people in the language that they would use, and the language which is most vital in him, and where he could put his passion. And particularly the reaction when he won the Booker was just nauseating, because it was all about how often he swears, and it's like, grow up. Just fucking grow up. It's not about that. It's about you don't like the people that he chooses to write about, and you don't like knowing that people who come and mend your plumbing have the same interior life as you and are as worthwhile and as mysterious and extraordinary as you, and get over it.
I became aware of oppression when I was about, I think, 11. You know, going to school, you're continually being told that you speak incorrectly and your language is not fit for decent people to hear, you know, and if you use words like I in the classroom, then the teacher would perhaps belt you or tell you you shouldn't do that. And if you say doon instead of down, or are you going down the road? If you spoke in a normal way, then you were punished.
Things aren't always as clear as they sometimes appear. You can have a way of moving which you reckon has to be ahead in a definite sense, and then for some reason what happens is fuck all, really. Nothing at all. Nothing at all is happening, yet there you are in strangely geometric patterns wherein points are arranged, have been arranged, in a weird display of fuck knows what, except it is always vaguely familiar, or whatever that means.
It's finding the storyteller's voice rather than saying that you want to write stories about certain people. Is that you want the voice in which the stories can be told, you know? So that's why you have to subvert the standard narrative voice. You have to find a way in which that standard voice becomes the ordinary Glasgow speaking voice, you know?
We're so keyed into language and how you know what class somebody is and how you think how bright somebody is how they speak. And what he's offering is a much more subversive way of looking at the underclass. Now you get lots of portrayals of the working classes, but it's always people who are helpless and people who are dysfunctional and people who are funny and people who are not like us because they're out of control. And he's like, no, these are bright people, but they talk the way they talk because they're from where they're from. And they're not mucking about and pretending to be somebody else. It's a fundamental and revolutionary thing.
The majority of British novelists seem to have watched the Thatcherite transformation of British society in the early 80s with a kind of appalled fascination.
The one thing that novelists seemed to be absolutely sure about in the mid-1980s was that they all hated Mrs. Thatcher. And in novel after novel of the time, she becomes a sort of pantomime villain. She becomes a sort of flat existence. And there's almost no attempt in the novel at the time to account for the kind of allure that she clearly must have had over the electorate.
Martin Amis wasn't particularly dismayed by the carnival of consumption in the early 80s. He recognised it was in all of us, an inclination to binge. His novel Money, published in 1984, pinned down the convulsive energies unleashed by the new economics in London and New York in blackly comic prose. Money is narrated by John Self, a porn and junk food enthusiast. Self is shadowed through the text by its author, Martin Amis. He even makes an appearance in this dramatised extract.
Today, I made a break with habit and tradition. Took my lunch at the Newborn restaurant. The Newborn's a hot little grotto of plastic panels and formica tabletops. Half cheap bistro, half Yob's beanery. Run by an elite squad of Italians, together with some straggly irregulars. You get all sorts in here, from dustmen to middle management. The menu is chip-orientated, but the place is licensed. Well, how else could it seriously expect my customers? I was sitting there waiting for the grub to show when Martin Amis came through the open door. You know, the writer I was chatting to in the pub the other night. The place was pretty full, and he hesitated until he saw the empty bench at my table. I don't think he saw me. And Martin sat down opposite and quickly flattened a book out in front of him. This kid's going to ruin his eyes. Fate. He looked up with a flash of panic. He recognised me. People usually do. It's one of the kickbacks you get for looking like I look.
I, in common with many writers, I think, feel that there is and this may be, again, just something that every writer feels in every generation, that there's a great convulsion of stupidity happening in the world. Mostly to do with television. People know a little about a lot and put very little effort into accumulating knowledge and culture. And when they do, it's almost like a sort of consumerism of culture. If this is happening, then perhaps what I'm trying to do in that book is to write as interestingly and as you say, with as much literary effect as possible, about a landscape in which there is no literature or culture. He comes across it, he encounters culture in various forms, in art galleries, in opera houses. And when he meets me, I'm a minor character in the book sent to perplex and bedevil him even more. But he can't make known sense of it. He has nothing to fall back on to interpret it.
But he doesn't have to. You see, I actually suspect you of a much more 20th century view than the one you're putting to me now.
Well, I think this is a sort of a new 20th century view.
But you're talking to me like Martin Amis, the character in the book, who's rather pretty, really.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
And I would have said that in the Martin Amis that I know slightly, there's a good slice of John Self.
You want a drop of this?
No, thanks. I try not to drink at lunchtime.
Yeah, so do I. I never quite make it.
I feel like shit all day if I drink at lunchtime.
Me too. I feel like shit all lunchtime if I don't.
Yeah, well, it all comes down to choices, doesn't it? It's the same in the evening. Do you want to feel good in the evening or do you want to feel good in the morning? It's the same with life. Do you want to feel good old or do you want to feel good young? One or the other, not both.
When Money came out, that seemed to me the novel that really did engage with contemporary political realities, contemporary economic realities. I don't suppose it's set out to do that, but it's become more and more topical, as it were, more and more able to speak about its period as time's gone on.
The materialism and greed and the exaggerated selfishness of John Self in Money it really reflects the era. But then that brings us to the crux of the thing, because the book is in fact about money.
Money is in shorthand, money is the opposite of culture. If you haven't, money is the first value that gets to you, unless you've got culture to stave it off.
One of the strongest impressions of the author in this book is of his ecstatic disgust, especially with the sort of things like the street culture, 42nd Street of New York. Would you say you suffer from disgust?
With regard to disgust, I think every writer, even the blackest writer, actually loves it all.
And you walk towards it rather than turning away?
I'm fascinated in distortions and distempers. I suppose it is temperamental, but I don't sit around feeling disgusted at all. I feel enthused.
I'm really interested in your indignation, because it strikes me no one could write the way you do
you're a really brilliant hater with an eye for what is horrible, what is grotesque, that indignation is profoundly moral. It involves a sort of rejection of 20th centuryness and the areas of waste and fatigue.
All writers think the world has reached its nadir, its low point. And in fact, this age will be lamented just like the last. That's the paradox. What you can say about the world is that while it may not be getting any better, it's getting infinitely less innocent all the time. It's like, it's been to so many parties, it's been on so many dates, had so many fights, got its handbag stolen so many times. So the accumulation is what makes the world seem at its worst always. Because it's never been through as much as it's been through today, the Earth.
I think Amos is full of class anxiety. Amos is an interesting figure, really, in that he's connected back to a very grand and much older tradition of English letters. There he was the son of a famous writer father. He had this reviewing job when he was very young. He's very high cultural, very kind of impeccably Oxbridge, yada, yada, yada. And into this world where we knew who were the top people and we knew who weren't the top people came the new money of the 1980s. And the new money drove a train through these fine class distinctions that people like Amos were kind of invested in. Throughout Amos's writing, there's a sort of instinctive disgust at a kind of hyper-virile working class male, who's probably likely to beat up the young velvet-jacketed poet. It's very interesting. You see that in a lot of the white male writers of that particular gang, that sort of generation. There's some real class anxiety stuff happening. The guy in a tracksuit is going to turn up, and beat your door in, maybe, have it off with your wife.
If Money stands the test of time by being an oblique, comically grotesque portrait of the 80s, there were other, more sombre responses to Thatcherism.
I think we forget, young people forget, the violence of Thatcherism. And I think there's something in my novels of that period that called for realism because life was violent, confrontational, very dirty. You went round Sheffield in those days, everything was for sale. You went round London, the streets were filthy. We've forgotten that because we have cleaned up a bit. Everything was filthy under Mrs. Thatcher, dirty. And I think dirty realism was what was called for. And I didn't want to escape from what I was looking at with my own eyes. I wanted to say, this is it. You may think you're living in a very fine cosmopolitan city with very grand restaurants, but if you just look down under your feet, this is the garbage you're walking over without even noticing. And I think realism seemed a very good mode for describing that to me.
Some writers didn't damn Thatcherism outright. For Jeanette Winterson, author of Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, who grew up in a working-class town in Lancashire, the issue was whether the new wealth would be used for the public good.
People often talk about economics and spirituality, the cultural life, as being separate, that business is dirty and rather mean, and that culture is elevated. But I don't really see that there has to be any contradiction. I think you can make money and you can do good things with it and you can regenerate a culture with that money. The Tories, if anybody could and if anybody should, might have harnessed all that money and vanity to a national good and said, OK, we're encouraging industry, we're encouraging enterprise, show us what you can do, build something. Let's have some new buildings, let's have some glamour, let's have some glory in London. What the Tories did, though, was to make money itself into an end rather than a means.
This is going to be the biggest commercial development in the world.
Private capital was only in it for private gain. There were no philanthropic gestures. There was no sense of national pride or community. And I think we need to have a much more vital connection in London, our capital, between the city we'd like to live in and the city we do live in. We can change things. We're not powerless. This city didn't drop from the sky on our heads and we've got to put up with it. It's not an act of fate the city. It's something that we choose and we make. And the more powerful our dreams are, the more beautiful our city will be.
The city as a place of possibility formed the backdrop to the most provocative novel of the decade. It's easy to forget, given its subsequent history, that Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses largely takes place in 80s London. The novel lampooned Mrs. Thatcher in the guise of a character called Mrs. Torture. It also included a thinly veiled portrait of Ayatollah Khomeini, then the Iranian head of state and the country's religious leader. Yet other characters acquire wings, horns, hooves. It dealt with the contemporary world in a defiantly unrealistic fashion. But it wasn't for its political satire or lack of realism that the Satanic Verses became notorious. It was Rushdie's conviction that a novelist had the right to examine Islamic belief by playing with its texts.
The reason the novel is called The Satanic Verses is that there is such an incident called the Incident of the Satanic Verses, which is a kind of apocryphal, kind of quasi-historical incident from the life of the Prophet Muhammad, which I first came across when I was studying Islamic history at college 20 years ago, and in which it seems that momentarily he brought down verses from the mountain in which three pagan deities were recognized at about the level of the archangels by God via the angel Jibril. And then at a later point said that the devil had appeared to him in the guise of the archangel, and that these were not genuinely Quranic verses, they were satanic verses, had to be removed from the Quran, and were replaced by other verses which repudiated these goddesses.
Rushdie was careful to retell the story of the Satanic Verses in the form of a dream, in a fictional place with fictional characters.
They're visionary sequences. They're not intended to have the validity of a kind of historical event because they happen in somebody's dream. And so obviously in a dream things change. Names change, places change shape. Nothing is as it really is in life. And I wanted those sequences to have that kind of visionary quality. And so quite deliberately did not call the city Makkah, did not call the leader of the city by his true name, Abu Sufyan. It's changed in the novel to another name, Abu Simbel, like the temple in Egypt, and did not call Muhammad because I didn't want it to be a picture of him, but a kind of dream of him.
A different shot, no problem.
Okay. In this reading, Rushdie ascends his own fictional mountain. Avatar, it isn't.
At the end of his wrestling match with the Archangel Jibril, the Prophet Mahood falls into his customary, exhausted, post-revelatory sleep. But on this occasion he revives more quickly than usual. When he comes to his senses, in that high wilderness there is nobody to be seen. No winged creatures crouch on rocks, and he jumps to his feet, filled with the urgency of his news. It was the devil, he says aloud to the empty air, making it true by giving it voice. The last time, it was Shaitan. This is what he has heard in his listening, that he has been tricked, that the devil came to him in the guise of the archangel, so that the verses he memorized, the ones he recited in the poetry tent, were not the real thing, but its diabolic opposite, not godly, but satanic.
When Rushdie was writing the book, this kind of question about the limits of language and the possibilities of meaning that was a common question in universities. That was the sort of thing that one talked about in graduate seminars. However, by using this material from the Quran as a way of talking about language and meaning and the limits of meaning, he placed himself right in the fault line between the part of the world that believes in the literal truth of words and the part of the world that is interested in the play of language.
Rushdie's fictions were taken literally by many Muslims. India and several other countries banned it. In Britain, the Satanic Verses was burned in public. When W.H. Smith's threatened to remove copies from the shelves of its stores, Rushdie went on television to defend his position.
Now, you are a political writer in a sense yourself. I mean, the wonderful thing about your fiction is that it's this wonderful imaginative roller coaster, but there is political bite behind it. And it's clear, not just in this book, but in other books, that you have satired Islamic fundamentalism.
Well,
in a sense, is it a surprise that you've had the depth of reaction from the
Well, I
Muslim
think
community?
Certainly. I mean, the scale of it is a surprise to me, and also is a great distress to me. I think what's true about the book is that it does break a number of taboos, which, in my view, are very important to break. The first is the idea that Muhammad's life cannot be discussed as if he was a human being. Muhammad himself always insisted not to have divine status. And yet, nowadays, we're talk about him as if he was kind of perfect being. There are other taboos. There's taboos about the discussion of Islam as it developed as a historical phenomenon. So yes, I think it's very important if the culture of a religion is to have an intellectual life, that such things should be discussed. And of course, the people who wish to control thought, the thought police, that's who's responsible for this action, don't wish one to do that.
What I love about it is the way it is attacking all received opinion. And it really takes seriously something that I think novels are fantastic at, which is to be a kind of free play of investigation. And so the Satanic Verses, I think, is an excellent example of something of refusing to take seriously what everyone else takes seriously.
29 days later, Ayatollah Khomeini issued his infamous fatwa.
Iran's spiritual leader Ayatollah Khomeini has said the author Salman Rushdie, who lives in Britain, has been sentenced to death for blaspheming the Muslim faith in his novel The Satanic Verses. In a message broadcast on Tehran radio, the Ayatollah also...
Rushdie disappeared into a John le Carré world of safe houses and round-the-clock police protection.
It just opened a kind of range of responses which even the most blaspheming of the enfants terribles of the 70s had not imagined, which was, of course, an outraged response from the people you're defending. Rushdie had been a brilliant advocate of multiculturalism, but the people who burned his books were the people he thought were his followers. That was just, I think, totally unprecedented and unexpected. I mean, we thought we were living in a stable, secular age. That was something we all missed.
5 months later, and events in Europe were dominating the news. Scenes like these were described as representing the triumph of democracy and the end of history. But as the Satanic Verses affair demonstrated, history refuses to end. Nevertheless, for the baby boomer generation, who'd only known a bitterly divided Europe, it felt like an era was drawing to a close. Ian McEwan witnessed the fall of the Berlin Wall and at the time realised it marked the beginning of a very different world.
I came here with my mind filled with a novel I was just completing. Coming back a year later, everything is completely transformed. And my time here last year has become part of a vanished past and has more in common, I suppose, with the mid-50s than with now. We stand in a new time, new time, new time, new time.
For a free Open University booklet featuring some of our best-loved writers, or to explore the connections between authors, call 0845 366 8022 or go to bbc.co.uk/British Novelists and follow the links to the Open University.